And I thought we could just listen to just a little bit of this one. It gives you an idea of introducing Captain Coffin. A year earlier, only the frail reed canals of the native coastal Miwoks had broken the calm surface of nature's most perfect natural harbor. With James Marshall's discovery of a dime-sized nugget in his Mills race on January 24, 1848, all that had changed. On December 6th, a battle-shocked, exhausted, and heavily disguised U.S. Navy scout, Lieutenant Edward Beale, had galloped cross-country on a secret mission to burst into President Polk's office with an official dispatch clutched in one hand and a saddlebag packed with $3,000 worth of Californian gold in the other. The president, who was, by the way, very excited, introduced Beale to the U.S. Senate as he was, raw-boned and filthy and red-eyed. To a standing ovation, the scout announced the news to the world. And that's the goal. After that, steamers and frigates in ever-increasing numbers furrowed the harbor like a plowed field, and the world rushed into Graveyard Harbor. That is, if one could find it without any maps. Captain George B. Coffin, a last-minute choice, was one of these men. For once, the winds were on his side. This afternoon, it was the fog, which was his enemy. And now we get Chapter 1. Click on that. Okay, here we go. Chapter 1, Graveyard Harbor. The glow of his pipe highlighted Captain Coffin's broad features. I'll try that one more time. Broad features. He was a bluff man with the hard lines of a brig as if built entirely of coke and Indian teak, copper-covered and copper-bolted like a sturdy ship. He was a fathom deep at his high water mark. His nose and wide chin were rounded as the sea wind had worn away their edges. His clear blue eyes were deep set, and his low, steady voice carried the natural tone of a man used to command. Against the wind's howl, blinded by coastal fog, Captain Coffin found his hearing oddly enhanced. He heard the tap of a slatting halyard, the howl of wind, and the sound of his own footsteps as he paced the deck of his Alhambra, but nothing more. There was not a sound from his 93 passengers, nor a murmur from his exhausting crew. Somewhere in the heavy banks of fog, buried deep behind the deceptive passage, was one of the most magical, mystical, and mysterious places in the world, and it was filled with gold. But Coffin had no map to guide him there. Between bouts of anger and confusion and disorientation, he had to fight through layers of vapor to uncover this strange land. To his mind, it was like peeling an onion. You peel back one layer, revealing the next, then a layer beneath, and another, until you have nothing. So far, it had been a voyage of mistakes. A mistake had brought him here and away from his family for years. A mistake by the government, and one authoritarian official had abandoned him floating along the unexplored west coast without a damned map. He looked to the ragged and dirty scrap of paper in his hand that was his map. He clenched his pipe in his teeth and thought back to what had led him to this spot, halfway between possibilities and impossibilities. Yes, it had been the maps to begin with, or rather lack of maps. Shame, Captain Coffin cursed, gripping the wheel harder. Eternal shame on the existing government. Unbelievably, the maps of the government's famous and extraordinarily expensive expedition of 8 to 9 years were still not widely available. Each had tried to find a map at Rio and attempted it again in Valparaiso and been rebuffed each time. Captain Coffin was not a man to ever give up. Finally, he acquired at the British frigate Inconstance. They had no maps either, not even a lithographic copy. But her sailing master was considerate enough to draw him a rough sketch of the approaches to San Francisco Bay. So Coffin had that. Pacific Squadron Commander Thomas Catesby Jones had been in charge of the mapping project and steadfastly produced few maps. Coffin wished he and his ilk were before him now so he could tell them in person with his fists. He ventured that if these maps had been important to any political party, be it Whig or be it Tory, there would have been stacks of them at every port, They would be raining from the sky, and he would have been fishing them from the surf with a grappling hook. Coffin's eyes strayed to the words he had carved over the main hatch, and that's his ship, by the way. Words passed down from father to son. He spoke them aloud, as if he ever needed a reminder. Be honest, be firm, be resolute. Unlike himself, the government had been dishonest, pliant, and irresolute by not delivering their promised maps of the jagged California coast. With no chart to guide him to this port, locating the headlands at the Golden Gate would be a sticky proposition. Lined along the starboard rail was a row of frozen statues colored a uniform gray. Coffin imagined some phantom sculptor having fashioned the immobile feature figures and posed them while he was hopelessly scanning the coastline for his port. These passengers had been grasping the starboard rail for most of the day, waiting, hoping, and praying, one leg over the rail. Their hands must be pretty tired by now, Coffin thought. They were clutching pans and shovels and pickaxes and retorts. One moment, there's a lot of noise. Recruits. One more shot. That's the San Francisco travel, by the way. It's 95 here, so you can imagine. Retorts, crucibles, and 20-pound capacity buckskin bags to hold the huge nuggets they expected to trip over in the streets of San Francisco. For security, one passenger had an ingenious box with a secret lock. Another had a false bottom to his trunk to hold his gold. He must be dead on his feet, Coffin thought, after holding so large a trunk for so long. Coffin himself was fatigued. Normally, he was an iron man and never tired. But today, for some reason, was different. It must be the weather, he told himself. That had to be it. If only it would clear. Early last month, a thundering black cloud had come driving along, darting forth intensely vivid forks of lightning and looking as though it was going to blow the Alhambra out of the water. Never give up. Keep your word, ran through his mind. It was the family credo. It was his credo. But this time, he might fail. His temper today was sharp, abrupt, and so unlike his normally reasonable and pleasant nature, that of a poet and artist and bold adventurer. On breaking into the afterhold to get a reserve of water, Coffin recalled, I was startled to find half the casks were empty and put the passengers and crew on rations. Tom Reed's ship was 2 days ahead of the Alhambra. The Coffin lost her when he put in for water. At 2 p.m., there was movement along the frozen gray statues to the starboard. A passenger, Mr. Comstock, had torn himself away from the tableau. Coffin watched him as he drifted to his side like a wisp of ghostly fog. I hope you do not take offense, Captain, he said meekly, still holding his shovel, but do you not think you are still too far south? It's the opinion of myself and some of the passengers that the harbor is much further north. 3 other passengers who possessed that same point of view joined Comstock as a Greek chorus who repeated his advice word for word. For most of the voyage, these experts, that's in quotes, these know-it-alls, that's not in quotes, had been subject to the jeers and jibes of the other passengers for their ill-conceived opinions. Thus, Coffin took their advice with a grain of salt. But now he had had enough. Go to the devil, he roared at the self-appointed Committee on Navigation, and give my compliments to his associates and tell them to follow him. By 2:30 p.m., conditions had turned favorable. Coffin could hardly believe it. Tantalized with unexpected light headwinds and calms, Coffin took full advantage of them. He kept his ship on the tack, which would place her head nearest his port. The fog began to thin, and he could see again, not well, but in silhouette he could make out the shape of the guardian mountain he was seeking. That was enough. Coffin's heart began to beat rapidly. They were going to make it. At 2:45, the Alhambra passed through a large school of dolphins, which brought a rare smile to his face. Momentarily, they grasped his attention as he knocked the ashes from his pipe. He considered the most beautiful of all fishes. When caught and lying in the sun, he rhapsodized, the colors of its skin are changeable, violet green, yellow, blue, orange, and red. It is the marine chameleon. Flocks of boobies, seabirds were alighting on the Alhambra's yards and rigging. Coffin consulted his ragged scrap of paper again, folded it, replaced it in his pocket, and winked at the self-appointed committee. He had just discerned a landmark a half-mile distant. Placing his best helmsman at the wheel, he stationed himself on the top gallant forecastle to shape his course for Fort Point, the southern boundary of the land so hidden that Spanish explorers had sailed past without a glance. At 3 p.m., Coffin got sight of a mountain, which forms the boundary of the entrance to San Francisco Bay. Gingerly, he put the helm slightly to starboard. On each side, a rocky bluff, covered with green moss, climbed nearly 300 feet to the sky. He craned his neck. These must be the heads, he thought. Point Lobos and Point Bonita, which form the vestibule of the Golden Gate. Point Lobos, 1/2 mile off the southern head, and a mile south of the main ship channel, was barely visible in the miasma. Point Bonita on the northwestern side of the gate was now invisible and no help at all. At 4 p.m., October 10th, 1849, Coffin wrote in his journal, I glimpsed the brown hills of the headlands as a rapid flood tide swept my freighter Alhambra through the Golden Gate. Seal Rocks and then Point Lobos and North Lobos Rock flashed by. He rushed past Point Lobos and Land's End at a 45-degree angle on a close range. As he swung fine on the starboard side, he observed 2 wide ebony stones, the like of which he had never seen. Mile Rock and Little Mile Rock were known together as Mile Rocks, so named because they are a mile south of the main shipping channel leading into the bay. The 2 side ebony stones rose 20 feet above the water, attracting mist and unwary hulls to their demise. Unmarked by light or bell buoy, they remained a constant threat to vessels entering and leaving the harbor, though in 1849 you could count those ships leaving on the fingers of one hand. The southern side of the entrance to the Golden Gate was spotted with a group of dangerous wave-swept rocks. Some were minor, but all were dangerous and able to sink the Alhambra. Coffin was cautious. He had a right to be. There was peril everywhere, including 11 species of shark in the cove. The dim shapes of Mile Rocks slipped past to the stern as he caught the wind. There were more such rocks, and he began counting to keep them in mind when he left the harbor and returned home. There was Blackhead Rock, Lobos Rock, and Pyramid Rock, even an East Pyramid Rock. But these deadly obstacles were only a few of those beneath the surface of the Golden Gate. There were great submarine cavities where the gate tides had washed the channel floor to a depth of 400 feet and pushed up the excess. He was headed toward Pyramid Rock when he encountered another dense fog. Now, where had that come from? He looked astern and was shocked. Heavy fog was funneling in from seaward like an express train. The hairs on his neck rose. These vaporous barriers of growing depth and crushing thickness were the Diablo, which is what the Spanish called the devil, the daily northwester which channels morning and late afternoon fog through the Golden Gate. Shaped like an arrow of vapor, the devil swept over the Alhambra and shrouded her as it swept toward the shore. The devil was leading the way, and Coffin was following, unable to see a foot ahead. His greatest fear was that once he had broken through the walls of vapor, battered and kicked and pummeled like a prize fighter to the other side, there would be naught there. Then silence. Coffin was stunned. The Alhambra had entered an area of inaudibility, and he found himself not only blind, but deaf to all around him. The odd configuration of the shoreline and cliffs at the gate deflect sound waves and make any signal such as fog bells ineffective. It was too dangerous to proceed, and he anchored for the night. He knew he was close. He heard a strange clanking and groaning. The ghost sleep was breathing and beckoning to him to come and join it forever. By lamplight in his cabin, Coffin busied himself while keeping an ear cocked for activity at the gate. He heard nothing. He waited for the fog to clear, but he would have to wait for dawn so he could be sure of his location and the myriad obstacles ahead. He got out his colors and inks. A skillful artist, he had painted a watercolor of a 694-ton freighter departing the Mississippi on April 14th. It was his way of remembering the ship if the worst happened. 8 months earlier, when spectators brought the Alhambra engaged in the skipper, the freighter had been in full horse shape. He'd fixed that. On an earlier February day this year of 1849, he'd arrived at New Orleans in command of the Ocean Queen of Newburyport from Liverpool for New Orleans, having on board 350 steerage passengers. The passage had been long, the first part of it exceedingly boisterous, but nothing like this one. At New Orleans, Captain Henry Shouff had come aboard to relieve him as part owner. And Captain Coffin says, as I was leaving for home, I received an application for a ship about to leave. Fitted out for California with freight passengers, I felt it was my duty to accept the situation, and I was placed in charge of the old ship, Alhambra, to put her in condition for the voyage and to fit her for 200 passengers, unquote. And we go back to Captain Coffin. That first day in New Orleans, I found her completely run out of tackle, he recalled, and rotten fore and aft. I put the vessel in dry rock to replace the copper sheathing and ship's rigging for $10,000. Unlike most captains, he was considerate of his passengers and crew. And here we're quoting him again. Everything was done and furnished that I could think of to make passengers comfortable during the long voyage, he said. Of an orderly bent, he also drew a detailed plan of his intended alterations and good intentions. He had dipped his pen in India ink and captioned the design, quote, plan of berth deck, ship Alhambra, unquote. With a flourish, he signed it, quote, by Captain George Coffin, unquote. It was good enough to frame. Following his plan, builders constructed 38 double staterooms, each 6 foot square, in 2 rows, and provided new mattresses, extra blankets, spare bedding, and sets of dishes. They added a kitchen on deck and quarters for the crew and first-class passengers and placed 4 long dining tables between the main mast and mizzenmast. The smaller cabin was for the crew, who were usually crammed below deck in the noisy forecastle. Coffin and the supercargo would occupy the aft portion of the larger cabin. 6 passengers who had paid extra were to live in the forward portion. Below decks at the stern, they installed quarters for a surgeon and servants, 6 foot square staterooms with ample ventilation along the starboard and port bulkheads. During the outward voyage, Coffin had written 4 issues of a shipboard newspaper, The Immigrant, and composed a musical doggerel for it. The first 2 issues consisted of 2 pages of foolscap, written out in full by Dr. Moss, a passenger. One motto began, we can all of us preach patience to others, but to patience this virtue ourselves is quite another and a far more difficult manner. For certain, Coffin was learning the lessons of patience. The passengers had long ago lost theirs. Next morning, Thursday, October 11th, the fog began to lift. Bit by bit, Coffin realized he was at the entrance of a huge bay extending to the eastward about 3 to 5 miles. A high, steep promontory was on the southern shore. On all sides, distant mountains at the gate hid the cove from the prying eyes of passing ships. As a man of strong will, a man of iron, Captain Coffin intended to batter and punch his way through. He would shove aside one clouded wall after another until he had reached his goal. But now the morning Diablo came sweeping shoreward. The wind behind Coffin was as the rumbling of a train. The decibels were shaking his balance at the wheel. The fog kept coming and hurtled over his head. He watched it head shoreward. The Diablo is usually much worse in the morning, though it rarely covers the entire city. Some acres of San Francisco are always visible. Coffin hoped the unseen shore might be one of these. The mist cleared, backing away from Coffin at such speed that he felt he was flying backwards. He put his anger to work, punching, battering his way ahead. Nothing was going to stop him. Another blow through the mist. He could see bits and pieces of the seaside scattered like a shattered mirror. As the Alhambra veered northeast, then rushed through the gate on a tidal wave of ocean fog, the passengers and crew gave the 35-year-old captain 3 lusty cheers. well deserved after a 180-day voyage, in which he had spent much of his own money to refurbish the ship so that his passengers and crew would be comfortable. If I possessed a taste for it, Coffin remembered, I might have received a warm embracement from every lady on board. If I possessed a taste for it, Coffin remembered, I might have received, he's married, that's just a little thing there, he's just saying that to himself. A magnificent harbor opened before his eyes. As if to welcome the Alhambra, the sky filled with white gulls, ducking, soaring, spreading their wings, their ha-ha-ha, echoing across bright blue water. Coffin began drawing his own map of Graveyard Harbor since he had none. He was gazing upon a land of overlapping half-circles, from the narrow crescent rim constituting the beach to a chain of wild and terrible mountains forming an insurmountable half-circle from the Presidio to the Mission to Rincon Point. Such an anchorage was beyond measurement. Coffin attempted it anyway. The main part of the freshwater estuary, the largest in the country, measured 3 to 4 miles east to west. 5 miles southeast of the gate, the Ghost Fleet spread for 2 square miles. Graveyard Harbor's considerable length from north to south was far more difficult to ascertain. Coffin visualized it as a silhouette, as a bright blue salamander with a tail some 60 miles long, its tiny feet representing tributaries. Because fog covered the southern end, because of this, he reached no definite conclusion as to its length. He looked for landmarks above and found only lofty sand hills, naked bound slopes, and pitched tents of denim. As for the shoreline himself, it was so thickly studded with dark hulls of all descriptions, riding at anchor both north and south. Strain as he might, Coffin could not see beyond the forest of masts in the eastern portion of the cove. I never saw so many ships at anchor in one port in my life, one observer whispered. I went up to the masthead and tried to count them, but they were so thick I found it impossible. Ships, and ships beyond ships, stretching away to the southeastward of every craft of sail, of every grade, of every shape of spar, of every rig of vessel, representing every nation that has deep water craft bearing the symbol and stamp of different countries. Ships, and ships beyond ships, stretching away to the south, until they were shut out by the hills the city was to be built upon. Coffin thought of the sandy beaches, inlets, rivers the ship was to be built upon. Coffin thought of the sandy beaches, inlets, rivers, and jagged cliffs, which, if counted as part, would triple the harbor's length. News of the California gold rush had overtaken many ships' captains who altered their course to set sail to San Francisco, and more coming each day. To his right, the sandhills of San Francisco rolled away, rising and falling in gentle slopes. Only Signal Hill stood in bold, jagged relief at the turn of the bay. Hundreds of windjammers and square riggers and craft for every port carelessly littered the cove. Vessels of all nations were here, from the Oregon coast down through the Spanish Main, and from all parts of Europe, and even the Orient. Some recently arrived, some cast off for 6 months, and all without much hope. A phantom, floating city, lacking any settled form of government, fronted the new city of Yerba Buena like a necklace. Had shipbuilders ever expected their fine vessels to meet such a fate? After that, steamers and frigates anchored before Yerba Buena. Here's a quote from Mr. Hubert H. Bancroft, who was really the first historian of San Francisco Bay. Not a likable guy, by the way. Hitherto, a glassy expanse ruffled only by the tide and breeze was now thickly studded with dark hulls, presenting a forest of masts and bearing the symbol and stamp of different nations. Captain Coffin hove up anchor and kedged his freighter up on a flood tank in a calm. And to replay him, at 8 a.m., every man Jack, seized by gold fever, showed their heels as they went over the side in their well-varnished hats, flowing ribbons, and white duck pants. And those 93 passengers whom he had coddled and advised and looked after like a father, conforming to the established local customers, they leaped the rail with their picks and shovels and swam for shore. They had left him alone in a city of forsaken ships on a sinking vessel full of cargo, with a storm on the horizon. Soon, all had departed except for Dr. Tapp, his fair, fat spouse, and plump black dog. Slowly, water began to rise in the hold. Coffin, blind by fog and light rain, distinctly heard hulls thumping against each other, like many hearts beating together all at once. Gloom, eternal gloom on my existence, Coffin snapped in one of his rare instances of self-pity. Many of the ships, idle, worthless, and with no prospect of ever leaving, must go down at their anchors, he predicted as he surveyed the young but ever-growing Ghostly. Was this the fate of his beloved Alhambra and his dreams and those of his investors, to whom he had given his promise to deliver the paid cargo into the proper hands and the passengers safely onto shore? He had never failed to keep his word before. But it had come to that. On those rolling, turning ships with their upstraining masts, no crew remained to clear the cables at the turn of the tide. No faithful watch stood ready to tumble and out and cry, "All hands!" when the wind picked up a choppy sea. Who would man the pumps as water crept up in leaky holes and strong currents caused an anchor to drag? No one but a few tenacious skippers like Captain Coffin. All the rest had deserted in a mad, wild exodus of golden-eyed marine. Squinting, Coffin studied the hundreds of ship's lanterns glimmering and swinging all about him in the fog. Had any man ever been as lonely as he? Was he to be interred in the graveyard in Graveyard Harbor as the Spanish had nailed the city, beneath the crushing tonnage of the Ghostly? Many obstacles were working against the packet trade veteran, ranging from the desertion of his crew and passengers to the weather swirling madly about him and growing stronger on the horizons. He looked to the darkening sky and shivered. Puffing out fog of his own from his pipe, Coffin tried to pierce the chilling mist shrouding the shoreline. Strain as he might, he could not see beyond the rickety Venice hemmed in by a forest of masts. Now everyone had deserted, gone to dig gold, leaving alone in the city a forsaken ship on a sinking vessel with worse to come. Coffin went below. Brought the ship to harbor, he wrote in his log, and moored her in a good berth and unbent the sails. The next day, not an individual was left on board. So I realized I read you a draft that didn't get printed, so I'm going to explain some of it. No, this is like an earlier draft. Yeah. But it's sort of fun. You now heard something nobody else in the world ever heard. But yeah, there's a lot of the lines that got picked up, and some of it was for little captions, things like that. But I like Captain Coffin, and he gets much more lively and excited, and there's shipwrecks and swimming ashore. Oh my God, it's such an amazing thing. And it's this city, they built a city on the shore, and it's all sand. It's a beach, but they're made of boats. I mean, it's like amazing. So now you have a ghost fleet on land, but he's trying to find his way, and just the people he meets, and it just gets better. But that was the last line. That's what he's writing about his crew, and you can tell he's very bitter. So anyway, I hope you like that. I hope I didn't read too fast or anything. I'm the first time I've done this.
Oh no, I'm sure there are people that will appreciate hearing it.
Oh, I hope so. It is with mistakes and all. That's the first anybody ever heard that, because I wrote it to myself when I wrote it. So yeah, I know it's sort of funny because I can't wait to read the next chapter. But you have to buy the book. That's going to be it. No, but I mean, I don't know. I read them all. I guess I just sort of like it. Yeah. Anyway, people should know more about Captain Coffin
and English Jim and.
Oh, I didn't want to go near them. He is the devil. English Jim. And the weird thing is, he has a double. I mean, they don't even know about each other. English Jim tumbles to it. But they look like Jesus. I'm not joking. And he's always getting mistaken. But both men got mistaken for each other. And the one is evil. And that's English Jim. He's terrible. But the other guy is a really stand-up fellow, and the crimes he commits, he wants to rob the city of San Francisco. Not just a little bit, all of it. He wants to rob the entire city of all its gold. And that's generally the thrust of his part of this story, which goes all the way to the end. But I don't think you've ever met such an interesting bunch of people. I just love them. And the next one also takes place in that 2 miles, but they're more they're tougher guys. You know, they're going to get rid of those criminals and so on. So it's just a wonderful book. It's nice and long, and everybody is taken care of. You'll learn everything there is to know. And that cover, which if I hadn't said, my son Aaron did, and I did a little pen and ink drawing of the ships, but he did all the amazing work with the colors and the color. The wood is the color of the ships. You know, I love the color of the book, and the lettering and the typeface and the inside cover. He does everything, and I love it. I generally try to forget my books when I'm done, but I've got it right here. It's on the shelf. Every day I get up and look at that cover, which is brand new, by the way. But he did all of it. So I'm super proud of that. So I hope people like that. You know, it's funny, the reason I got to writing, it's sort of strange, and again, if I repeat myself, let me know. When I came from from Japan, when I was 17, where my parents were in the service and so on, and I came by myself, and I thought, oh, this is great. I'm going to college. And well, you know, I did say this before, I think. I'm a realistic artist. I like drawing things. I like understanding. Well, at that time, everybody was throwing paint, and I mean literally. So I went up the first day, and they're throwing paint, and they're not even looking at their canvas. Now, I'm sure it was great stuff. Yeah, I did say that. But it made me change my mind. I said, I'm lonely. I don't fit in with this. You know, I'm 17, the Lord. And so I went across to the library, and I picked up a book. And it was a children's book. I know I said this. But it was so good. And it just filled me with joy. And I thought, my God, if you can write a book and illustrate it, Wind in the Willows of all things, it just made me feel great. So it sort of awakens me a drive to not only write books, but to make them accessible to lonely people and to have drawings. And it just took off from there. And I just never stopped. And I stopped counting. Let's just call it 40. But I have a lot of books. And I just don't like stopping. I get up in the morning, do that all day, and go to bed. It's just the most fun. And I feel sorry. Every once in a while I hear somebody that says, I love what I do. And I look at them on TV or in a movie or something. And they do. And that's what's shaped them. And it's made them into better people. And that's what I do. I love what I do. And you know, I have an art career I should be working on, but in general, doing this are wonderful. And these people are all well educated. You'd be surprised. They know the classics, and they know the future. And generally, the thrust of it is, Captain Coffin is, you know, 3/4 of the book through. He's looking to himself and he's saying, I'm not ever going to find anything the like of Ghostfleet. A vast floating city. This is it. When I leave, I'll never see such a thing.
Yeah, he keeps trying to extricate himself, and but yet he knows this is, you know, I'm not going to find anything like this.
Yeah, you're not. Yeah, and he's wanted even when he leaves. All of the sheriff, the Texas Ranger, they're all waving goodbye. You know, and every time he gets out, the tide changes and sweeps him back again. And it's just lovely. I just love that.
Well, and I love how much, you know, thematically are these you know, good people doing bad and bad people trying to do well. You know,
I know.
Trying to put their best foot forward.
And you know what? I think that that chapter, that's the only time I ever really heard Captain Coffin angry. He doesn't say anything. He's pretty good about it. So, you know, it's usually for bad people.
Yeah, well, he's like 5 or 6 months coming here, and he's in sight of his goal, and everybody bails overboard. These last,
I know. So,
oh yeah, well, I mean, just the vigilantes alone. You've got the criminal element that's come in during this, and
and I don't think anybody ever really. There's a lot of detail. There's more than you would suspect, but if somebody is in my story, you're going to hear what boot size they wore. I mean, I like to try to do that, you know. And it's really interesting how the book ends. I think you'll like that.